Hi again. For a little bit of a kind of insight and that sometimes the development process you need to think outside the box, and this is kind of a typical example that I struggle with for some hours. And what I'm going to show here is that the way I created lakes and rivers is kind of a homebrew little thing. I tried to, there is a function to do it, but it wasn't really good enough. It's just an early beta that can construct rivers. So I basically put together my own way of solving it that I think does an adequate job. The problem was when I added these kind of automatic little rivers and waterways that that are generated just using the flow data from the erosion. Then when I use lakes and rivers, they kind of mask out the erosion. So you get these kind of areas that are devoid of any waterways or anything. This is a kind of flat area that should have more of marshlands and rivers and stuff going through it. But it, thanks to the way that I had been forced to work with the rivers and lakes, I kind of made the area devoid of the rivers and stuff going through it. So the way to try and deal with that, I was looking into it, and in fact I have to go back earlier in the process, and over here where I create rivers, I have a river erosion device that erodes the terrain around the river, but in order to make the river flat and not bump up and down, I have to mask it, and that's the reason that this comes from. But if I take the river erosion data before I mask it, then I can actually reinsert and use that data, and I take it from here earlier when I have the rivers, and I make it, and then I name it river erosion flow, and then it goes through all these gateways, and then it ends up here where I have the creeks, these that are automatically generated, and then I take the river erosion flow and I put a slope setting on it, so only the flat areas will actually get it, and I put a height selection so I can kind of tweak it back and forth how much I want to, and then I add that to the creeks, the mask that set the creeks, and then I can reintroduce that data. And then when we look at the file here again, now I have plenty of more data. There's a lot of small rivers and creeks and things going back and forth, and there is wetlands and marshlands and swampy areas around the rivers and lake. Not perfect, but it's way better than it was before. So sometimes you have to try and figure out and think, where do you have the data that is appropriate. Sometimes you have to hide it in order to mask it so you only get the rivers and the erosion in the right place, but you can still use the data. Even if you mask it from the terrain elevation, you can still use it in the formation of rivers and marshlands. So all the areas here that are completely flat, they will get marshlands, and areas that are actually have natural erosion flow, they will get small tiny rivers. And I've also kind of blurred them a little bit, so when you have the flatter it gets, the more blurred it becomes. You can see that in the rivers. So that's a way of you have to look at the whole process and how the data flows. And often the data you need in order to create something might not be readily available here, but it's because you masked it actually, and kind of hidden it, but it's available earlier. The problem is that you have to make sure that you don't get a feedback, because World Machine will not accept a feedback. You can't have something later affect something earlier in the process. So, so that's the drawback. But in this case, I masked out the erosion, but I can still use it. Even if I have masked it out for elevation purposes, I can still use it in order to create the wetlands and the small little rivers and stuff in the device I call creeks that are here. So this was just a little illustrative example of how you do development. You have to sit and figure, and this took me 5 hours to figure out how to solve this issue. But I haven't solved it perfectly, but it's solved kind of decent, good enough that it will work. And now you can see there's a whole bunch of dead ends in here. this is an earlier file, the latest version that you can download and use. If you're a cartographer pledger, then you can, these things have already been, I've at least taken away most of the devices that have become redundant. They're part of it here. But this is the kind of thinking that you have to try and figure out. Try and see the flow of data and figure out what you need when you need it, and mask it in some aspect, but you might be able to use it in some other aspect. So that's the key in this, and that way you can kind of sift through the spaghetti and get it to work eventually. So good luck with your creations, and talk to you soon. Bye.